Hello and welcome to our Fellows Talk. I'm Claudia Rizzini, the Executive Director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. It is my pleasure to introduce our Frieda L. Miller Fellow Valentina Rozas-Krause. How can a memorial apologize? This is the question that Valentina has been asking for over a decade. While she was still an undergraduate student, architecture student, she won a national competition to design a memorial for the victims of the military dictatorship in Chile in the 1970s. How do you carry on the memories of a generation haunted by atrocity? How does a government reckon with its past? Are monuments, plaques, or statues enough to absolve guilt? Big philosophical questions like these lie at the heart of Valentina's research. As an architect turned historian, she uses a design-focused approach to examine the role that memorial plays in symbolic and material reparation after political conflicts. From Berlin to Buenos Aires, to Santiago and San Francisco, Valentina takes a tour around the world of memorials in public spaces, reframing them as three-dimensional apologies with stakes in the past, present, and future. During her year at Radcliffe, Valentina continues to work on her book, Memorials and the Cult of Apology, which assembles some of these global case studies and synthesizes a unique vision of atonement in the modern era. I'm thrilled to welcome Valentina Rozas-Krause to the podium.
Thank you, Claudia, for that very generous introduction. Hi, first I want to thank my fellow fellows. You've been wonderful, and I'm so excited to be here and part of this very diverse and a little bit crazy group of people. Also, thank you to the Radcliffe staff who've been so incredibly supportive. So as Claudia said, for the past 15 years, I've been engaged with monuments and memorials, first as a practicing architect and later as a researcher. So in this talk, I will present this idea of the memorials and the cult of apology, which is the subject of the book I'm currently writing. And it explores the relationship between apologies and memorials. So 15 years ago, I was living in Santiago de Chile. I see a fellow Chilean there, studying architecture when a memorial competition for a neglected lot inside the city's main cemetery sparked my attention. Me and a group of friends, we entered that competition, submitted a design, and for some reason inexplicable, we won, and that became my first job as an architect. The publicly funded memorial was to be located on Patio 29, the historic site in which during Pinochet's 17-year military dictatorship, hidden remains of detenidos desaparecidos or disappeared were found. After the end of the dictatorship in 1990, the newly established democratic government started to exhume the bodies of Patio 29 in order to identify them and return them to their family members. However, the identification of the remains were very difficult, and partly the scientific knowledge in Chile wasn't enough. So the process turned into a series of accidents in which the state returned, but then reclaimed bodies based on wrong data. And it is in this context that this competition in 2008 came out. So they were building a memorial as they were also dealing with this very scandalous case of misidentifying the remains, the human remains. And so while the competition guidelines called for a memorial to the victims, we had no actual names to put on the memorial, and the bodies had been removed to identify them. So etched onto this imaginary black material, which you can see here, were placeholder for real names, but no actual names. This is the design we submitted for the competition, exactly as this. And our basic design idea or strategy was to create half a frame for this historic site, not to touch the site itself, but to allow some public space to emerge around it without touching the very delicate history inside of it. So in the years that passed from its conception to its construction, Memorial Patio 29 changed tremendously. It lost its inscriptions and it became significantly less monumental. And this black abstraction of our original design led to individual concrete blocks. The surface of these blocks invoked the Pacific Ocean, which was the final resting place of so many victims of the regime. The Memorial Patio 29 was finally inaugurated in 2010, but not without controversy. 20 years after the end of the military dictatorship, the absence of the victims' names remained unsettling, as if the memorial failed to achieve its most basic function, to remember. In this context, some human rights organizations demanded that the complete list of victims be included in the memorial, even if this was impossible, while others refused to accept the permanent apology or permanent closure that a memorial on a site of unidentified victims proposed. It soon became clear to us that Memorial Patio 29 was supposed to do more than just remember. It was supposed to apologize for the disastrous misidentifications of the human remains of Patio 29. And that indeed was at the center of the debates surrounding our design. Whether a permanent apology from a democratic government that had done the bare minimum to repair for the wrongdoings of the dictatorship was acceptable. My book, Memorials and the Cult of Apology, addresses this issue, this problem, by looking at the effect that built apologies can have on the built environment, on the actors involved, and on historical narratives. Our memorial certainly didn't solve the forensic issues of the site, but if I might very humbly say so, I think it achieved something. It managed to create a forum to acknowledge the atrocities of the dictatorship, while at the same time creating a public space for the community. And this photograph you see here is actually one of my favorite ones. It's during a March for Memory, and you can see that despite the controversies around it, it's very well used. It plays an important role in the commemorative landscape in Santiago, and it has this very humble capacity to disappear underneath people when it is necessary. So for me personally, the cult of apology starts with this memorial, with this experience. But let me give you another example of what I mean. What do all these people have in common? Yes, Lila's helping me. They've all apologized, either on their behalf or on behalf of the institutions they represent, or sometimes that can happen simultaneously, as the case of Bill Clinton. What I want to point out is that we are surrounded by apologies. It is most likely that each one of us in this room and in the Zoom over there have recently apologized to someone about something. And to show you how wide-ranging apologies are in our contemporary culture, I want us to consider for a moment that there are apology toys. Released in 2016, this is a group of Japanese figurines, Godzilla's nemesis, who are holding a press conference, yes, a press conference, to apologize for the destruction of cities. But even here, apologies' effectiveness is mocked. This big slimy guy on the right in his sign says, "I apologize for nothing." Jokes aside, apologies are everywhere. Scholars call our present time the age of apology. Australia even has a national holiday to say I'm sorry to its indigenous community, Sorry Day in late May. So how can memorials say I'm sorry? What role do they play in this age of apology? My research explores that question through a series of contemporary studies that reveal different relationships between memorials and apologies. Some memorials reinforce existing apologies, others demand apologies, and others fiercely resist this idea of apologizing and moving on. So perhaps the most straightforward case to get us started is the memorial that commemorates an apology. This is a photograph of Willy Brandt, the West German chancellor, kneeling in front of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising Memorial in 1970, which is considered to be a pivotal moment of post-World War II repentance for Germany. Wrapped in a somber, dark coat, the chancellor slowly walked towards the massive figurative bronze memorial dedicated in 1948 to honor the 1943 act of Jewish resistance against the Nazis. He laid a funeral wreath of white carnations on the steps leading up to the west side of the memorial, stepped back, and fell to his knees onto the wet pavement. For 30 seconds, Brandt remained still, looking into the distance. No words were uttered, and according to the West German media, his gesture was received as an impromptu, humble, and honest apology. Brandt later reflected about that day in Warsaw, writing, "At the abyss of German history and burdened by millions of murdered humans, I acted in the way of those whom language fails." Brandt's kneeling is the historical ground zero of the cult of apology, not only because the Holocaust inaugurated a new form of memorialization, but also because the Holocaust introduced us into a new way of apologizing. In the space created by the Coming to Terms movement in Germany, the cult of apology developed as a secular religion instilled with lessons of humanity to avoid the break of civilization to reoccur. Moving beyond words, I argue that this age of apology has been transformed into a cult by tapping into the built environment. Like gestures, memorials have been invoked to speak when words cannot be found. It is not a coincidence that Willy Brandt's kneeling, an overtly Christian gesture, took place in front of a Jewish memorial. Here, visual representation and commemoration played a crucial role in circumventing the limits of textual representation. Nathan Rappaport's figurative memorial represents the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising through a heroic group of historical and allegorical figures, combining Jewish archetypes and socialist realism. While the west side of the memorial is dedicated to Jewish heroes, the east side renders Jewish victimization in the form of a procession of 12 figures into exile. Both sides are held together by a granite wall, echoing the ghetto walls, the Berlin Wall, and the Western Wall in Jerusalem. This, by kneeling in front of the heroes of Jewish resistance, Brandt chose a persuasive backdrop for his Ostpolitik, transforming the Holocaust into the central symbol of German guilt. The Chancellor's gesture was paramount because no form of reconciliation was possible between West Germany and the Eastern Bloc without an act of public repentance. But the entanglement between memorials and apologies does not end here. In December of the year 2000, commemorating the 30-year anniversary of Brandt's kneeling, a monument was inaugurated to honor and remember the gesture. The modest scale of the monument stood in clear contrast to the list of authorities and prominent guests that attended the event, including the German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, Polish Prime Minister, Willy Brandt's widow, and Günter Grass. Located only 700 feet away from the original monument and located on the site of the actual historical ghetto, which had been transformed into a park, the monument mimics its reference. It's also a wall with slightly sanded surfaces, but at a much more modest scale and with brick cladding. And it includes the figurative relief in its center. The bas-relief depicts the chancellor kneeling on the pavement in front of the funeral wreath. The massive group of photographers, authorities, and attendees that can be seen in the backdrop of the real photographs have been omitted. So have the buildings in the horizon. Mimicking Brandt's silence, the use of text in the monument is minimal. The central relief is only graced by Willy Brandt's name and the date of the kneeling, while a brief historic plaque narrates the context and details of the monument's dedication. Very few 30-second gestures have become memorials, which is evidence of the importance of the gesture at the time and still today. Likewise, the memorial illustrates the urge to make an evanescent gesture like an apology permanent. So why build a memorial for an apology? That's my main question. I argue that is because apologies are really bad at remembering. Apologies inaugurate new beginnings, settle contentious historical accounts, and unbind those responsible from their crimes. Their power actually lies in their capacity to upend historical narratives. Apologetic memorials like this one do not cease to be memorials, but their meaning exceeds the conventional understanding of memorials as remembrance and warning. Judging past actions and portraying moral stance towards the past, acknowledging guilt and collective responsibility, these types of memorials develop new historical narratives rooted in the power of reconciliation and forgiveness. By nature, apologies are speech acts. Embedded in the fleeting present, they lack the potential to endure without the help of textual or visual representation. So while in the past apologies had been passed on to the future mainly as words, within our increasingly visual stimulated culture, apologetic memorials fill that need to touch, remember, and visit actual apologies. Beyond memorials that commemorate apologies, the chapters of the book I'm writing here, the Radcliffe, unveil that apologies can be smokescreens, that apologies can compete against each other, that apologies can be demanded, forgiven, as well as resisted. In the first chapter of my book, I follow the trajectory of material apologies from Brandt's kneeling to German reckoning with National Socialism at the site of the former Gestapo headquarters in Berlin, which you see here. While the Holocaust paved the way for how we apologize today, my work starts by examining how the cult of apology emerged in the early 80s in Berlin. I argue that the shift from the focus originally on the victims to focusing on the perpetrators was a reflection of the growing influence of guilt, reparation, and apology in that post-war context in Germany. Through the transformation of the Gestapo site, now known as Topography of Terror, into a documentation center about the perpetrators and their institutions, the cult of apology allowed a new generation of Germans to confront their own past and to analyze their role in the Nazi crimes. However, the reliance on the cult of apology is not infallible, in particular when we talk about memories. So the flip side of the German profuse examination of Nazism, and also the second chapter of my book, is the relative indifference for the crimes and genocide of German colonialism. Here, apologies play a very different role in the hands of Black and Afro-German activists in Germany and Namibia. Calls for an official apology and a memorial to the victims of German colonial genocide have helped to shed light on the absence of German postcolonial policies of reparation. World War II and its concentration camps tie the history of Japanese-American incarceration in the US with Germany and the Holocaust. Yet the role that apologies play in the case of the Tanforan Assembly Center Memorial in San Francisco, California, is also different. The third chapter of my book illustrates the issues that arise from the limited temporality of apologies. Even though the 1988 Civil Liberties Act apologized for the unlawful incarceration of citizens of Japanese ancestry, today, Japanese American activists demand an extension of the redress and recognition of the 80s. So working against the power of apologies to close contentious chapters of the past and inaugurate new narratives, these activists are opposing the finality of apology with, guess what, a memorial, pictured here. You might have noticed that my chapters work in pairs. So the counterpoint of the Tanforan Memorial are the so-called Comfort Women Memorials. There are two in California, very close to the Tanforan one, and there are many all over the US. This one here is in Detroit, Michigan, but there are also many around the world. Their purpose is to demand apologies from Japan for the sexual enslavement of women during World War II. This is the chapter I'm writing here at the Radcliffe, and I hope it will help me explore two themes that go through the book. One is the global aspects of this cult, how it can travel from one very different place to the next and adapt to different historical contexts. And the second one is the way that women are represented in these apologetic monuments. And spoiler alert, it's almost always as innocent children. So some of the risks of both accepting and demanding apologies start to emerge around these two chapters. Following this lead, the final chapters on Argentina delve into these issues to analyze apologies in the context of a widespread aversion against apology. I examine both how the president of Argentina, Néstor Kirchner, officially apologized for the years of impunity that followed the military dictatorship, as well as the ongoing resistance against apologies and everything that comes with them. In different ways, every chapter demonstrates that material apologies can shift existing power dynamics. They can empower victims and minorities, but they can also exonerate perpetrators and their accomplices. So let me save you the book and skip right to the last chapter, to the end of it, which is also how I see the end, at least for now, of the expanding phenomenon that is the cult of apology. I hope it is clear by now that even though apologies can contribute to democracy, recognition, and reparation, they are also deeply problematic. And there's perhaps no clear example of what happens to a site of memory when it tries to counter the cult of apology than sites in Argentina. So in March of 2018, I was one of those little dots surrounded by 100,000 people in central Buenos Aires and the axis Avenida de Mayo, which crosses the entire city, marching for memory. For the past 30 decades, every March 24th, human rights organizations have organized a march to commemorate the coup d'etat that initiated the civic, military, and religious dictatorship that spanned from 1976 to 1983, a period that overlaps with the Chilean military dictatorship which I mentioned at the beginning. Only 6 years after Brandt's kneeling, Argentine armed forces started using Nazi methods to torture and murder its own citizens. The military junta sought to eliminate the so-called subversive elements of the Argentine society. And while this category was broad enough to include all opponents to the military regime, militants of banned parties, workers' unions, and Jews were especially targeted. The young age of the victims shows a clear intent to wipe out an entire generation. Preceded by a period of escalating violence, the dictatorship murdered and disappeared 30,000 people. This state terrorism had both a visible manifestation, but also happened at an underground, hidden network of death and violence. And this march, this memory march, is yet another example of how memory gets manifested in the world, in this case through performance. So as we were marching towards the presidential palace, Casa Rosada in Buenos Aires, I saw this red paper sign with the words, "We do not forget, we do not forgive, we do not reconcile," written in thick black letters, and in smaller letters, the postscript, "No special prison." While the latter refers to the ongoing trials against those responsible for state terrorism and the very special prisons they get, the first part of the sign reflects the 3 actions that we most commonly associate with apology, so forgetting, forgiving, and reconciling. Throughout the day, I saw more signs of what I came to think of as counter-apologetic resistance. The stance was most often conveyed in this very abbreviated version, which is neither forgiving nor forgetting, ni perdón ni olvido, which was written on T-shirts, balloons, flags, and on the pavement, and thick white letters underneath the flag of Argentina. So following this Argentine resistance to forgive and forget the atrocities of the military dictatorship, I argue that in particular circumstances, apologies have acquired strong negative connotations, which in turn have fueled a discursive, spatial, and aesthetic resistance against forgiveness. The best illustration of what happens to a site of memory when it tries to counter the cult of apology is this place, Club Atlético, a former clandestine detention center in Buenos Aires where victims were forcibly taken to be interrogated, tortured, and murdered. The memory site consists of an archaeological excavation, which you can see here, a plaza, an off-site lab, and a small exhibition space. The detention center was located in the basement of a building of the federal police, and more than 1,800 people passed through the site between February and December of 1977. After less than a year of operation, it was closed and demolished to construct the elevated highway Autopista 25 de Mayo. While most of the killing center was completely destroyed, the basement remained buried underneath the foundations of the highway. And these are the remains that activists, survivors, and neighbors started digging up and discovering here in 2002. So situated underneath this very intentional and noisy highway, the actual site of memory is difficult to visit. One could even say unpleasant. One can only enter it with a tour guide. In this case, it's the person depicted in the black backpack. And this limited access has practical reasons. Staff and funding are very important, and security are very important restrictions. This, at first glance, this site looks like a little more than just an excavation pit and scaffoldings and caution tape and a very small exhibition in a nearby building. This off-site exhibition contains some of the objects that have been found in the excavation. In this modest room, illuminated by fluorescent light, an old police cap, a dented coffee mug, a photographic printing plate, and a ping pong ball, all objects that once belonged to the victims or the perpetrators, are displayed with excruciating attention to detail. 2 blocks away from the Club Atlético excavation, this office is where the everyday operations of the memory site take place. Archaeologists, conservationists, educators, researchers, and maintenance personnel work on the open plan 3rd level of a nearby building, surrounded by aisles of box archaeological material found at the site. Space, time, and funding restrictions make the cataloging and analysis and preservation of these objects a very slow process. So only 50 of the more than 1,000 objects that have been found here can be viewed by the exhibition's visitors. I will zoom in on 2 of these objects, the ping pong ball and the police cap. The ping pong ball rests in a glass display case surrounded by a police baton, a bottle, 2 bullet shells, and a set of coins and food packaging from the 70s. The short labels that identify each object indicate no more than a name, in this case, ping pong ball, an inventory number, and a logo of the Human Rights Secretary, which supports the operations of the site. So the ball's round and off-white surface hides important clues about the everyday activities of the detention center, its victims, as well as its perpetrators. Indeed, the ping pong ball is an iconic object that distinguishes testimonies that happened at Club Atlético from other sites of torture. No other clandestine detention center had a ping pong table. Thus, the repetitive sound of the ball became one of the features to recognize and categorize testimonies that belonged to Club Atlético. Since detainees spent most of their time blindfolded, memories of sound pierce through their testimony as small moments of knowledge about their surroundings. 2 sounds were particularly telling of Club Atlético. One was the sound of cheering fans, which revealed the proximity to a soccer stadium. And the other one was the sound of a ping pong ball hitting a wooden table, like this. Club Atlético survivor Ricardo Peiro. For Club Atlético survivor Ricardo Peiro, the ping pong ball is material evidence that demonstrates the veracity of survivors' testimonies. Another survivor said that until he saw the actual ping pong ball, he did not know if the monotonous sound he so vividly remembered was a recording employed for torture or an actual object. Seeing the ping pong ball allowed that survivor to contextualize his memories of imprisonment and to silence the rhythm of the ball's play that had been ingrained in his memory as a form of torture. In this sense, the ping pong ball is more than just material evidence of a sonic memory. Its existence has a therapeutic effect on those who were imprisoned at Club Atlético. So beyond its meaning for survivors, the ping pong ball also offers a glimpse into the realm of the perpetrators. The coexistence of this object of leisure with a prison, torture, and extermination chamber reveals the extent to which terror had been normalized amongst the armed forces. The scene that the ball paints is gruesome. Killing time as they killed people, board guards played ping pong, while prisoners died in minuscule underground cells without charge and due process. Mundane and unapparent, the ping pong ball reveals how the quotidian can become monstrous, how everyday objects can be used for torture. Animated by the words of tour guides who draw on survivors' testimonies, the ping pong ball becomes a powerful pedagogic resource to bring visitors closer to the imprisonment experience. While an identification with the prisoners is prompted, the banality of the ball also suggests some level of humanity in the perpetrators. In its simplicity, the ping pong ball has the potential to unlock a multifaceted history that is not only situated in Club Atlético, but that speaks to broader debates. Contesting the assumption that torture was well hidden, the contact between the ball and torture, as well as between the ball and the world, suggests porous limits between the concealed and the unconcealed. These broader questions linger on the materiality of the ball, but its main purpose is really to identify particular individuals and crimes against them. In the glass case next to the ping pong ball sits a disassembled police cap surrounded by police badges, another baton, a black leather uniform, police uniform shoe, a broken mug, and a gun holster. The vitrine presents the police cap's interior band extended in a narrow white cushion. Visitors can read the word nazista, Nazi misspelled, scratched onto the brown leather-like surface of the band next to an inverted swastika. It's not clear whether the inscription was the self-proclamation of the cap's owner or if it was the result of the action of another guard or inmate. The ambiguity of this inscription, whether an act of glorification, defiance, or denunciation, plays a secondary role. Tour guides focus on the police cap as a witness to the uniqueness of the Jewish incarceration experience and as an ideological X-ray of the perpetrators. Showing again how words and objects are interconnected, there are many testimonies that speak to the anti-Semitism of the guards of Club Atlético. Survivor Ana Maria Cariaga states, "From inside we could hear a cassette with Hitler's speeches at full volume and the hollers and laughter of the repressors." Likewise, Nora Stachilevich gives testimony to the especially cruel treatment that she suffered for being Jewish. The Holocaust wends its way through Club Atlético, not only from the Jewish perspective, but also from the viewpoint of the perpetrators, revealing the glorification of Nazi ideologies by members of the Argentine military. It should come as no surprise that the official democratic apology for the state crimes committed during the dictatorship took place on a site widely known by Argentinians as Auschwitz. In 2004, when Argentina's president apologized for the state crimes, he did so standing in front of the Higher School of Mechanics of the Navy, which you can see here, a site of massive imprisonment, torture, and murder. Like Auschwitz, it's a symbol for other concentration and torture camps across Argentina. So despite their potential to bridge personal stories with social, ideological, larger phenomena, most of the objects of the Club Atlético exhibition function primarily as material evidence for crimes committed against particular individuals and as clues to reconstruct the everyday activities of this detention center. The larger repressive structure of the regime remains somewhat elusive, hidden behind the very factual reality of the objects and the testimonies that bring them to life. This is not a shortcoming, I would argue, but a choice which reflects the way that the past is conceived at Club Atlético. At Club Atlético, the past is rendered as the outcome of the dialectic between testimony and space. The past exists, to put it in a different way, because materiality and human experience coincide and leave a trace. In a circular movement, the archaeological finding of the step over which survivor Miguel D'Agostino stumbled into the makeshift prison that was Club Atlético proves that his testimony is real. At the same time, D'Agostino's testimony confirms the historic authenticity of the step and the need to preserve it. So neither words nor building are enough. Instead, they work together, merging into one single narrative about the past. The objects of the Club Atlético exhibition function as etymons, true bearers of traces of the past. Objects like words can have etymologies that can bring us back to origins. The makeshift exhibition space, short labels, and almost absent curatorial design of this museum reinforce the idea of minimal intervention, of a past presented in its immediacy. There seems to be no gap between the world and the object, but this is only apparent. Club Atlético's uncurated exhibition is in itself a form of curation, which becomes apparent when analyzing the circulation of objects that have been chosen for display. To be presented to the public, the 50 objects had to be removed, cataloged, preserved, and mediated. After carefully registering the exact location and state in which each one of these objects was found, archaeologists first cataloged them. The cataloged objects were carefully packed in acid-free papers and placed in bags with inscriptions, which were stored in labeled boxes resembling a Cartesian grid. Researchers then advanced to a third level of identification of the objects based on their appearance in oral and written testimonies of survivors. Indeed, this cross-checking between object and testimony is the most important step in the series of transformations of these objects into bundles of narrative. The influence of testimony is actually not reduced to this last step, but intervenes along the entire process. The excavations of Club Atlético were guided by testimonies and were actually performed in the presence of survivors and their families, as you can see on the right side of this image. The selection of objects to be preserved and exhibited at this site is based on what the archaeologists themselves call testimonial value. In other words, testimonies of survivors serve the function of curating the Club Atlético exhibition. The value of these objects is centered on their truth-telling role as witnesses of a past crime, where currency is truth for the sake of justice, which stands in opposition to reconciliation. There's more to Club Atlético than these objects, which is also true for the cult of apology, which takes place in multiple scales, from the fine grain of materials to buildings to entire cities. As I mentioned before, besides objects, the site of memory is comprised of an excavation, a plaza, and an off-site lab and exhibition space. But it does not end here. I argue that the influence of the memorial extends to the entire neighborhood of San Telmo, where it is situated, through a neighborhood march that the Club Atlético committee organizes every year. This scale of structure helps to distinguish the multiplicity of material dimensions at play here at Club Atlético. Comprised of a series of separate but distinct elements, Club Atlético has the capacity to shift like no traditional memorial can. Opening and closing fences and doors not only shifts its urban footprint, but also its meaning. These scales illuminate Club Atlético as a place of counter-apologetic resistance, which reveals a compromise to represent the real and uncurated thing, an institutional lightness that allows space to be transformed, a rejection of overarching conciliatory narratives, and a preference for grounded experiences of survivors, visitors, and neighbors. The cult of apology, which I examine throughout my book, can be identified through the use of space, in particular memorials and museums, as means to demonstrate the sincerity behind an apology, reinforce its message of forgiveness, and ultimately contribute to the goal of reparation. What counters the cult of apology is less clear-cut, as these complicated unfolding scales of Club Atlético demonstrate. What should be clear by now, and I'll be done very soon, is that Club Atlético cannot be reduced to a single object or space. Instead, these nested scales and the many pieces they contain form an assemblage. Because its main purpose is not to remember, and because it resists design abstractions, I sustain that Club Atlético is not a memorial in a traditional sense, but a counter-apologetic memory site preserved as material evidence for the ongoing trials against the perpetrators. Club Atlético resists the global influence of the cult of apology by putting the victim and the pending punishment for the crimes before reconciliation narratives. Unlike some of the apologetic memorials discussed in my work, Club Atlético does not pretend to heal, amend, or pacify. On the contrary, it started as and remains a site of denunciation. To stay true to the victims, the narratives of Club Atlético are grounded in particular names, experiences, and things. Testimony, objects, and space thus appear entangled as one continuous source of knowledge. So let me share a final thought about Club Atlético. Historian Josef Yerushalmi asks, is it possible that the antonym of forgetfulness might not be memory, but justice? The idea, the belief that justice is the only thing that can counter forgetting is at the core of the site. Club Atlético's counter-apologetic resistance arises because justice is at odds with apology. Apology has a particular meaning in the context of the Argentine memorial landscape, which is the outcome of the role that the public trials against the perpetrators and the interruption of this process through amnesty laws have played on the commemorative landscape. In this particular context, then, apology has been equated with injustice and forgetting. Thus, focusing on justice instead of remembering, Club Atlético emerged as a response to the decades of impunity that suggested that the crimes of the civic military dictatorship had to be forgotten and forgiven. The power of Club Atlético, as you see it here, lies in its unfinished quality. The unfinished memorial is a reminder that actions need to be taken to remember, to prosecute perpetrators, to care for the victims and their families, as well as to address the profound socioeconomic inequalities imposed by the dictatorship's neoliberal policies. I chose this case to talk about today because in the context of my book, it serves the very particular function of reframing the rest of the chapters. It's my favorite chapter because it gives me some hope, and I hope you too, that there are other ways to deal with our difficult past than to apologize and move on. While the memorial or future memorial for the African victims of German colonialism, as well as the comfort women monuments demand an apology, this site, Club Atlético, demands justice. However, the gap between actual legal procedures and the ideal of justice produces a tension that impedes an easy consumption of the site. Ultimately, these tensions further stress the incompleteness and permanent call for action of Club Atlético. Finally, to conclude, why should we care about any of this? Why does the cult of apology matter for us today? So let us think back to May 25th of 2020, the day that George Floyd was murdered by 4 police officers in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Apologies quickly surfaced in the aftermath of Floyd's death. A week later, after having fired the 4 police officers involved, Minnesota Police Chief Medaria Arredondo visited the site of Floyd's killing. He apologized to his family, spoke to the community, and kneeled in front of the makeshift memorial that local activists had built in honor of George Floyd. The police chief's kneeling occurred in the conspicuous absence of an official apology by the US president. You know what I'm talking about. Arredondo's gesture echoes Willy Brandt's kneeling in Warsaw, which echoes Henry IV kneeling in front of the Pope. In all these cases, kneeling becomes an act of respect, recognition, and repentance that exceeds the verbal and textual domain. Kneeling conveys something that words cannot fully grasp, and as I've argued in this presentation, so do memorials. The cultish aspect of apology starts to emerge around this constant repetition. The different cases in my research reveal that in places as distant as Berlin and Buenos Aires, and at times as remote as 15th century Italy and contemporary US, strangely familiar apologies re-emerge in the form of gestures, memorials, and buildings. The material aspects of the cult of apology are indeed a response to apology's tendency to forget and forgive. Like the human impossibility to live unhistorically, I would argue that it is impossible to live unapologetically, even though my Instagram feed is trying to convince me otherwise. At least in a community, I think it's impossible to live without ever apologizing. In acknowledging this impossibility, my work on the cult of apology is the search for a balance between the uses and the abuses of apology in the built environment. Multiple cases in my book demonstrate that there's not one single answer. Built apologies can shift and mutate from one place to the next, leaving very different traces behind. So rather than essentializing the cult of apology as good or bad, I hope my work on this presentation will inspire others to look closely at apologies, to analyze how people and actors are involved in them, as well as to recognize the production of material, symbols, and spaces to anchor these apologies to space. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valentina. There are lots of questions. So let's start with the first one. So memorials are created with a specific ideological lens by a group of people, artists, architects, governments, etc., that not everyone shares. In your experience, what are some of the elements of that a monument can miss?
That's an interesting question because I think building memorials has become such a convention that the question makes sense. So a good memorial, quote unquote, has a list of victims, ideally recognizes the actual wrongdoing, is placed in a good public space, and has some dignity in the materials that it chooses. But I think in following that step-by-step process, we also miss the specificity that makes memorials actually function for a particular place. So I think there are things that could work in one place and not in the next. And I think that's part of why my book looks at so many cases, because the grounded realities of particular contexts and places really shift the meaning of places like this.
The next question is about the word cult. Would you please elaborate a bit on the choice of the word cult? Is it mainly because of apology is often not followed by reparations?
This is a question I get all the time. And I have multiple answers for it. Part of it is cult has very strong connotations in the US context and not so much in other contexts. I borrow this use of the term cult from an art historian called Alois Riegel, who talks about the cult of monuments. And he writes at the beginning of the 20th century, and he says that as he works in Vienna and is basically in charge of preserving monuments, and says, now that this is a process of secularization, right, and modernization. So a lot of the city is changing, things are being destroyed. So he needs to come up with a way of preserving and finding meaning for certain places. And he ties the word cult to the sort of way in which we engage with historic monuments that have some past value that replaces a ritual that was previously religious. So he sees our sort of veneration of monuments as a response or replacing some religious form of engaging with spaces. That's why I use it. I must also say that I think it's, I'm interested in the etymology of the word. It also means inhabiting, it means caring, it means, obviously also has this origin in religious aspects. But I think there is, and again, this ties to the first question. It ties in with a certain ritualistic aspect in which apologies and the space is created to offer them sort of repeat themselves. And I think it's a strong word, but I like this idea that we should question a little bit how we play into that ritual.
Mm-hmm. And now a question about governments and states. Can you theorize the state a bit more here? Do states use apology to mark regime change?
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. I think but again, the apologies are not always offered or demanded from the same actors in my work, and that's why I chose these examples. Sometimes, up until very recently, Germany had not officially apologized for the genocide of the Nama and Herero and what is today Namibia. So in that case, it's really, the monument is used as to demand something from a state which is an other, and to demand representation and recognition by a state that has totally neglected remembering anything before the Holocaust. But obviously, we can see as the president of Argentina and so many, and Willy Brandt apologize and make these big gestures in public spaces in front of memorials. It is used by states. And the case of Germany is obviously very clear that Willy Brandt's apology is instrumental. It was in the context, it was the initiating step of the Ostpolitik and trying to, open up the Eastern Bloc and have some relationship with West Germany. And I think that's also why in the historical debates it's so interesting that people say that it was an impromptu, not a planned event, making it somehow more real. But looking at it later, it obviously is part of a state politics.
Are there other examples like Club Atletico of memorials that center around justice rather than apology, or is there something unique about the Argentine context?
I think there are other sites. There are more sites in Argentina, particularly, but I think there are also sites in other parts of the world. I'm thinking of maybe Rwanda, but I think the closer you get to the actual historical event, it makes it possible for justice to occur. And which also makes time a complicated thing here, because as in the case of Argentina and Chile, the perpetrators are of an age of, close to, they're in old age and could die in the next, 10 or 20 years, which means that if they're not prosecuted now, they will die in impunity. But if we think about in 40 years, Grupo Atletico will have a different meaning. And I think it is more common for sites like South Africa with apartheid, where really the conflict is so recent that it's not easy to just say this is a thing of memory, but this is actually an ongoing thing. And the same happened in Berlin. The topography of terror, when it first opened in 1987, had names of Nazi bureaucrats as part of the exhibit, people who were not at the time, had not been part of the Nuremberg trials. So there's always, I think, when you're that close to the event, some dimension of justice. And I think that's when actually apologies can serve justice, when they cannot just, blur and say the past is over, let's move on.
One last question. Your presentation was longer than, so I should probably, yeah. If you can keep the answer brief to this question. What is the role of interactivity in apology memorials? Do they keep victims and those who are remembering separate? Or is universalizing suffering a crucial aspect?
That's a fascinating question. I would say in the ones that I've studied, universalizing suffering plays a key role. And this has been, guided by the way, for example, the Holocaust Museum works in DC, sort of eliciting empathy, very strong empathy with the visitors, and most of the concentration camps and Auschwitz and others do the same thing. But I would say there is a big debate around these spaces, whether that is moral or whether that just limits the way we can conceive the past when we only think about how it would affect us individually. I think by only playing into the idea you could have been a Jew or you could have been a victim of the dictatorship, it limits our understanding of community and how these are actually spaces where that can happen, the bringing together of more than an individual. And I think there's also, I would think that empathy has to be treated with caution, but I do think that most of these sites, for the sake of, attracting visitors and being clear in their meaning, elicit an empathy with the victims.
Thank you, Valentina. Thank you for your talk and for your perspective on the matter. I also want to thank the audience for their terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe events. You can find more about future events and watch video of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you very much for joining us today and have a great rest of the day.